What happens when your D&D edition changes? Why do they release new editions of the game? It's been 50 years. They're still working on the rules? Can you just keep running your normal campaign? Do you have to switch? Can you convert old adventures to the new edition? What does converting even mean? What happens if you want to switch, but some of your players don't? Could you just ignore the new edition and keep doing what you're doing? Well, I was actively playing D&D through 4 major edition changes and every kind of drama you can imagine, and we are going to talk about all that. This is about 85% history and 15% advice, so if you want to skip it all, here's the juice. I don't think that 5.5 is that big a change. You probably won't need to convert anything. You can probably just keep playing the same campaign and take the stuff you like from 5.5. They're not revising the game because they think there's a problem with the rules, so you can sort of relax. But if you don't want to relax, if you want drama, well, keep watching. Hey folks, Matthew Coltano here, internet's busiest dungeon master. Wow, that is not true. There are lots of DMs busier than me. Anyway, this video is about what happens when a new edition of D&D comes out and what you have to look forward to. Folks got a lot of questions, but it's not that scary. But it's also about why new editions come out, and it's also sort of the history of the game in total, which is a long story. It's a good thing I talk fast. And fair warning, you've heard some of this before, especially if you've been in my Twitch streams for any length of time, so no, you're not having deja vu. When I first started running the game videos in 2016, 5th edition was already 2 years old, and Wizards of the Coast was doing surprisingly little onboarding. Onboarding is just the process of getting a new player to the point where they are done learning, and now they can just play. We used to call this teaching people, but thanks to the marketing folks, now we onboard people. Like, I was so frustrated at the total lack of any onboarding help from Wizards that I made these. I don't know if you ever saw these. These are character creation cards for 5th edition. I actually used these and they worked really well. Just an attempt on my part to make it easier and more fun for a new player to get into the game. Why didn't Wizards of the Coast do something like this in 2014? Well, that's an interesting question. Anyway, I made all these videos and stuff like the local area PDF and the Delian Tomb and the character cards for 3 reasons. One, my love for the hobby, I guess you would say. Anytime you have a hobby like this, where it's not just the activity, but also the community and the history of it that you love, you get to a point where you don't just want to play, you want to give back to the community. And that was me in 2016. I mean, it's still me, frankly. It's still the primary motivator for most of what I do. And there was a new edition of D&D. That's the second reason. But really, the main reason I started making D&D videos was we had this huge influx of new players, and it seemed like no one was really paying attention to them. 2015 and 2016 brought in a ton of new players, and statistically, you are one of those players because of 2 things, I think. Critical Role and Stranger Things. Stranger Things reminded everyone of that game they played in high school, and whatever happened to that? Do people still play that? And I think a lot of people wanted to play when they were younger, but they didn't know anyone who played. So Stranger Things gives all those people an excuse to try to get a group together, because you could say, it's the game they're playing in Stranger Things, and everyone goes, oh yeah, I know you've heard this story before, but it is appropriate to the point I'm making. In 2016, I was still at Turtle Rock Studios. I went to a concert. I had VIP tickets, so I was in the center of the second row. And my friends and I got there early because it's LA and parking is ridiculous. So we're sitting there in the second row. We're almost the only people there. We're watching the roadies set up the stage. And this dude walks in front of the stage. He's got a blazer on, so he obviously works here. And he stops right in front of us, turns to me. I can see his badge. It says floor manager. And he says, Mr. Colville, welcome to the show. And I was like, wow, they don't fuck around with the VIP service here. But as we're talking, it becomes clear to me this dude actually knows me. And I'm thinking, did we go to school together or something? So I ask, do I know you? And he gets this knowing smile on his face and he says, you don't know me, but I know you. And before I can figure out what on earth he's talking about, he says, I'm the dungeon master for the Staples Center. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? That's amazing. And he tells the story of how he used to play in high school and he sees Stranger Things and he's like, do people still play that game? I miss it. So he goes online, finds my videos, binges all of them, and he's like, I am doing this. So he emails the entire Staples Center, which is a lot of people work there. He figures, well, I got to email the entire org if I have any hope of finding 4 people who want to play. and like 30 people respond. Well, this was that era. A lot of people played D&D in high school or college, and they loved the game and the hobby, but they moved on. They get married, they have kids, they get a career, a mortgage if they're lucky, and they sort of assume D&D wasn't just something they enjoyed when they were teenagers. They start to think they enjoyed it because they were teenagers, and they're adults now, and too old for that nonsense. Then Stranger Things comes along and reminds everyone how much fun D&D is, and so literally millions of people are like, hey, I wonder. About this same time, Critical Role hits and is massive. I don't think people really understand how critical Role was in revitalizing this hobby. Before Critical Role, explaining D&D to a normal person was sort of impossible to explain how it works and why it's fun. RPGs are not like other games because of the existence of the DM. So when you talk to a normal person about this weird game, you sort of sound like a blithering idiot. But once Critical Role existed, anyone could just send their friends or family or coworkers a link and say, it's this. And you get these good-looking, professionally charming people playing the game, and I think anyone watching that would say, hey, that looks like fun. You know, the Hasbro investors, they see the line go up and they think, surely this is because of our brilliant CEO. But honestly, I think they just got lucky. I don't think 5e is the principal cause of 5e's success. I think it's Stranger Things and Critical Role. And social media, frankly. D&D is just the best game for memes. Every session, just tons of memes generated. Anyway, the reason I bring all this up is because, in my opinion, 2015 to 2018 represented a whole new generation of players entering the hobby. And if you are in that generation, you don't know how good you have it. It didn't used to be like this. It used to be really shitty. It sometimes seemed like a majority. I'm sure this isn't true, but it felt like the majority of D&D discussion online before 5e was people slagging each other off based on which edition they liked. This is called edition warring. And we haven't really had that in the last 9 years because most people talking about the game online have only played 5e, so no reason to war about editions. But things were not always thus, and you may get to see it happen live. People find it really hard to talk about these things without getting very spicy, because for reasons I don't pretend to understand, people's identities get wrapped up in this stuff. I understand making the hobby like a lifestyle choice. That makes sense. But you will see folks get really heated when they talk about which edition of D&D they think is best. This is called one true way-ism, and I first encountered this behavior and that phrase in the late 80s. That's right, back in the 1900s, between Mac and PC users. When you bought a computer in the 80s, you basically had two choices, Mac or PC. And this was before PCs had a graphical user interface, so everything looked like this, as opposed to this on the Mac. So you had not just two competing platforms, like Android versus iPhone, and they're basically the same, so unless you're a clueless teenager, you don't really care who uses what. You had two entirely different and incompatible visions, philosophies about what using a computer should be about. So, of course, people decided that this was a moral choice, and if you picked the wrong answer, you were a bad person. You would be surprised at how literal I am being right now, but anyone who remembers life before Eternal September will verify. I don't know, maybe a majority of people in the hobby were happy with their edition, but didn't care to debate the issue. But we didn't hear from them because the edition warriors sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I have no idea if this will happen with 6th edition or 1D&D or whatever they're calling this. 5.5? 5th edition, 2nd edition? I think 5.5 is the most appropriate name. We'll see. You may be spared the ravages of serving in the edition warrior trenches because I don't get the sense that this new edition is going to be a major change. We'll see. It is rarely clear why we get new editions of D&D when we do. It's been 50 years, but they're still trying to figure out the rules. People are usually pretty cynical when it comes to new editions, and this is the rare instance where I think the cynics are usually right, but not in useful ways. Do not trust simple answers to complex questions. Sometimes the cynics aren't cynical enough. I think the main motivator for making AD&D, the original 2nd edition of D&D, was that the authorship of the original game was in dispute. There were two guys with competing visions, philosophies about what D&D was or could be. Sound familiar? But instead of Mac and PC, you had Dave and Gary. Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. And me even bringing this up is just inviting people to come out of the woodwork and be weird at me. I recommend John Peterson's book, The Game Wizards. It goes into all of this in incredible detail. But having read this book along with a lot of other people's reports on this era, my take on this divide was that they were both wargamers, but Gary was a lot more serious about turning rules into products. And he felt like this crazy thing a different Dave Wesley, had sort of invented was only really playable by other people if you grafted these wargaming rules onto it. So from the beginning of the hobby, you had folks who thought that D&D was the set of rules, and other folks who felt like it was more of a tradition, a way of doing things. Oh my God. Do you know what this reminds me of? I literally just thought of this. It's East Coast versus West Coast synthesis. Oh my God, I am so happy I made this video. Okay, settle in. This is my video. We go as long as I say. So originally, back in the late 60s, if you wanted to make music using like transistors and diodes, like a weirdo, instead of just guitars and pianos, you had two choices. There was West Coast music synthesis, which was led by a guy named Don Buchla, and then you had East Coast music synthesis, led by a guy named Bob Moog. Now, these were also called additive versus subtractive synthesis, and that is a real difference, but the big difference between them was their vision. Don Buchla was part of a group of engineers and composers who hung out at a place called the San Francisco Tape Music Center. Don't sigh and roll your eyes. This is interesting. Anyway, it was the 60s, and both of these groups, the counterculture folks in San Francisco and Bob Moog in New York, are inventing the entire world of synthesizers out of basically nothing. The difference was, Don Buchla felt like he and his friends had invented a new way to make music. They felt like, now you don't need to learn scales and music theory. You can just play with one of their synths and make new music and screw all the formalism you get with music theory. Just plug in some cables and start wiggling knobs and something amazing would happen. They thought they were inventing new music machines for normal people. They thought they were starting a revolution where you didn't already need to know how to play an instrument in order to make amazing music. It is a very utopian, egalitarian idea that music could be for everyone. Well, Bob Moog somewhat more pragmatically figured, these things are expensive as shit to make. Who's going to buy them? The only people who can afford them are successful musicians. Well, it's 60 years later, and Bob Moog won. People still use Buchla synths, but Moog's vision won because figuring we need money to make these, so that means we got to sell them, and who's going to buy them except rich musicians? He stuck a keyboard on his synth. There. Now you can play it. Now anyone who can play the piano can play a synth. And as a result, Moog Music was a successful business for decades. And almost all synths these days have a keyboard built in. Unless you are weird like me. And he was right. He figured only rich musicians could afford one of these anyway, and literally Keith Emerson from Emerson, Lake and Palmer bought one of the first Moog synths. So this is an important lesson. You have this new movement, a new way of doing things, but competing visions. Keyboards or cables? Command line or Windows? Rules or... I mean, Dave Arneson was a rules guy. It's just that his rules tended to be a lot more like guidelines. I get the impression he wasn't great about finishing projects. Like, he liked making rules and designing games, but actually editing them into something other people could play, turning it into a product, in other words, was tedious. He was happy handing his stuff to Gary because that meant it would actually turn into something. But also, I think he saw the hobby as being more of a collection of habits and traditions rather than a game that was about the rules. Rules you could sell. Well, rules made it easier for people to learn. So Gary's vision won. Gary stuck a keyboard on this weird lumpy rules set, and now relatively normal gaming nerds could play it. He collaborates with Dave on these rules, and money wasn't really a thing. No one in tabletop made any money off it except maybe SPI and Avalon Hill. I think they imagined D&D might generate as much as $300. Well, they made a lot more than that, and by the end of the 70s, D&D was bigger than SPI and Avalon Hill put together. Suddenly, there is real money on the table, more and more money every year. Remember the cynics I was talking about earlier? Well, Gary gets tired of fighting with Dave over who did what when Gary feels like he wrote most of this stuff and he feels like he did and was doing the work to make it a product. So he wanted to keep the money. I wasn't there. This is all my interpretation of events after reading a lot about this. I am sure people in the comments will help shed light on the details. Well, a new edition of the game that was by Gary seemed like the solution. So AD&D happens for two reasons. First, yeah, D&D was a mess. A lot of the rules were in Dragon Magazine or even just zines, amateur press magazines, which were amazing and which turned into this cauldron where people cooked up new rules, many of which became sort of official house rules, just spread by word of mouth. So there was a good reason to revise the rules. Plus, the game is a huge hit now, and they can make a hardcover edition. They couldn't do that before. Exciting. That means they could sell it into bookstores. But there was also the desire to make a new thing that Dave Arneson would theoretically have no claim to. So the cynics say it's just a cash grab, but I think with every edition of D&D, the cash grab is real, but there are lots of other reasons to revise the game. The cash grab happens because every edition of D&D since about 1986, tons of people buy the core rules. It sells well, but each supplement sells less well. So you get what we call the long tail. Initial sales very high, then each product sells to fewer and fewer people. Lots of product lines work this way. It is not unique to tabletop. The old movies are still good, but they keep making new ones. Once a company is down at the end of the long tail, things start looking pretty grim, so they decide, time for a new edition. Get people to buy the White Album for the 11th time. That's the cynics version of the story, and there is a lot of truth there, but as we've seen with Gary and Dave, reality is often more cynical. Dude just didn't want to share the profits of the old game, so he writes a new game that literally just says, buy Gary Gygax, in the hopes that he can keep all the money. But also, new editions bring in new players. That is a real thing. The old edition got some heat, and there are always some folks who are like, that sounds interesting. But it also seems intimidating, especially if you go into a store to check it out, and you see there are dozens of products. Good Lord, where do you start? So a new edition gives those stragglers a new opportunity to get on the bus, get excited, get in on the ground floor of something new. That is a real thing, and we should be glad for it because it brings new people into the hobby. The fourth edition of D&D, which everybody called the second edition because it was the sequel to the second edition, which everybody called the advanced rules because the third edition was called the basic rules. You only had to listen to that. I had to write it. Came out in like 1989. I was a player back then, so this was my first edition change. I think D&D has generations, and I think they are, by and large, distinct from one another. But they don't match the generations we're used to, like Boomer, Gen X, which thankfully our entire culture has just decided to pretend doesn't exist. Nothing could make Gen X happier. And then you get like Millennials and Zoomers. All of these categories are arbitrary with the possible exception of the baby boomers. The baby boom was a real demographic phenomenon, not just something people made up. I think I am a second generation player. The first generation were the folks who mostly started in the 70s. They were younger than the boomers, but older than Gen X, and the game was more of a hobby and less of an industry. By the 80s, TSR was making a lot of money off of D&D, more money than any hobby game had ever made, more money than any war game or card game ever. Suddenly there were ads for Dungeons and Dragons on the radio and TV. Can you imagine that in this day and age? I remember hearing a radio ad on mainstream radio for Star Frontiers. That's how big TSR had gotten. They could buy major national ad time for another RPG they made that wasn't even D&D. D&D was in the Sears Christmas catalog. It was a big deal. Fewer people played then. This is important. This is really important. Fewer people played back then, but the company that owned D&D was spending a lot of money promoting it, buying ads. They were investing in the game in a way I submit Hasbro has never done. Hasbro wants to invest in the brand, not the game. That is a critical difference. Anyway, my generation is in junior high and high school in the 80s, and this is when D&D becomes a phenomenon. This is why the first season of Stranger Things happens in 1983, because that was the beginning of D&D becoming huge. By 1987, they wanted to make a new game, really revise the rules, because the AD&D rules were incredibly janky. Game design was not the discipline it is now, and D&D was just cobbled together. It wasn't a system. It was just a bunch of disparate rules, each of which was like its own unique creation. Well, the devs, by which I mean the designers, wanted a new game. But the money people, get used to this, folks, the money people were like, no, do not make a better game. Do not do that. And here's why. I really hope you stuck with this video, folks, because it's getting really interesting. You see, the folks who own D&D believe, probably correctly, that they need game stores in order for this hobby to work. D&D doesn't make a lot of money for game stores, but if you are D&D curious and you don't know anyone who plays, you can go hang out at the local game store and meet like-minded weirdos. And it's the 80s, and there's no way to get the rules to the people other than in print. So you need the game stores to sell your product. Well, the game stores have invested a lot of money in the old edition. In AD&D. Every game store in the country had practically the entire D&D back catalog in stock. And what do you think those game store owners are going to do if you come out with a new edition and you say, hey, guess what? All those old books and modules are now obsolete. But please give us more money for a new game no one is asking for. Does this sound familiar? The devs were basically told, just look pretty and do as little as possible. That was the directive from above. Change whatever you want, as long as the new edition is 100% compatible with the old edition, which means don't change anything. So, second edition comes out, and it is basically just first edition again, but better organized? Sort of. There are meaningful rules changes, but you need to be a real D&D nerd to notice them. I was a DM back then, and you could sort of buy any adventure from any edition, AD&D, Basic D&D, Second Edition, and they all worked fine. It wasn't even always obvious which adventure was from which edition. They all had orcs, and they all had armor class. I wasn't just playing and running D&D back then, I was also very online. You know, we had the web in the 90s, we had forums, and we had edition warriors. It's sort of remarkable how much people argued about AD&D versus Second Edition, considering that's basically the same game. A lot of people thought basic D&D, or what we now call Moldvay Cook after the folks who worked on it, a lot of people argued very strongly that basic D&D was the real D&D, and this AD&D nonsense was just a cash grab by TSR, except they put a $sign where the S was, because that seems clever to people who are not clever. So basic D&D versus AD&D was probably the first edition war, but we didn't have the internet back then or social media, so it was a lot easier to be a fan and a player and have no idea these edition wars existed. I mean, really, the first edition war ever was probably folks like my friend Steve in 1976 arguing that introducing the thief class was a mistake. They liked the game the way it was in 1974, and they didn't like the ways in which it was changing. They just didn't have Reddit to complain about it on. Second edition is where people start asking about converting adventures. You will see that with this new edition. Folks will ask, can I convert the adventures I already have to 5.5? Well, the answer is probably. I don't think 5.5 will be that different from 5e. I think this is very similar to second edition, where it was just change as little as possible. But converting adventures has always struck me as a very weird thing to do. It was less weird in the 90s because second edition was so close to AD&D that you could sort of just convert one to the other. Just change these specific things and you're good. They were like two dialects of the same language, very easy to translate between them. I think 5.5 is going to be the same way, so I would not worry about conversion. What does it even mean to convert between different editions of D&D? I ran 4th edition for years, very happy with it, and we often played classic adventures. People imagine converting an adventure is like a function generator where you just dump the old adventure in, you do some math, and you get a converted adventure. I never bothered converting anything. I just read the book sort of metaphorically, not literally. So an encounter says there are 6 orcs here, and I think, okay, so a medium difficulty orc encounter, and I build one of those myself. That's it. I just eyeball it. Because what is an adventure anyway? It's a plot, some NPCs, a couple of maps, probably a map of the dungeon, a map of the local area, the tavern, a bunch of encounters, and a bunch of rewards. Well, plots are plots. Nothing to convert. Most NPCs don't have stat blocks. Nothing to convert. You can see where this is going. Maps are maps. Nothing to... Well, converting maps actually can be a thing if you end up, for some reason, using a really old adventure, because the scale of the maps changed from the 70s to the 80s. It used to be one square was 10 feet, and you could fit 3 people walking abreast in 10 feet. Because in the 70s game, maps weren't tactical. No one imagined you played on the map the way we do now. They were really more like architectural diagrams. They just existed as a thing to explore, and it was gridded to make it easier for everybody to communicate about where they were and what was going on. And different editions treat things like secret doors differently. The 70s game was all about secret doors. It was one of the principal features of the game. So depending on which edition you're converting to, you may just need to be aware of stuff like this. But as long as you're using an adventure made in, the last 30 years, I don't think you have to worry about that stuff. I ran 5th edition for years, just assuming that the stuff from earlier editions was in there somewhere. And I was usually right. That's sort of 5th edition's only virtue. But it did mean every once in a while I would award magic items right out of an AD&D adventure for which there was no equivalent in 5e. That is something you would need to be aware of. Rewards. You can't assume that the magic items and treasure from one edition make sense in another. But it's also fun to hand out magic items that aren't in the rules. Players like that feeling of discovering something novel. So the reality is most of what's in any adventure needs no conversion. Lord Saxton is a wanker in every edition. Plots, maps, really only encounters and rewards are a problem, and you don't convert them, you just look at them and you say, okay, this is a Medusa encounter. Is it a hard, medium, or easy Medusa encounter? And then replace it with a Medusa encounter you designed and that you know. That's part of the fun. Designing your own encounters can and should be fun. I think it was more fun in one specific edition, but we'll get there. Mostly what you're doing is just adapting the encounters and treasure. I remember when I was working at Wizards of the Coast in 2000, they had learned through a very expensive marketing survey that like literally 1 million players or something crazy like that never switched from AD&D to 2nd edition. They were happy with the game they had. They were perfectly capable of homebrewing their own rules and adventures, and so they just ignored 2nd edition. Get used to that. It's going to happen a couple more times before this video is over. So that was my first edition change. And the weird thing is, my friends and I, we never for a second debated whether we should switch from the old game to the new one. We were excited for the new game. Sure, it wasn't that different, but we liked that because we liked AD&D. So cleaning it up and making it more organized and sensible, that had a lot of value to us. We liked learning new games, but in 1989, we didn't need D&D to be a new game. We had lots of different games already. Also, 2nd edition is when the desktop publishing revolution hit D&D. So 2nd edition just looked way cooler than AD&D. The presentation of the adventures shot up, and we liked that. It seems like every edition of D&D eventually wears out its welcome, and 2nd edition was the first time I experienced that. 2nd edition came out in 1989, and we were still playing in 1999, but the game was feeling very creaky compared to newer games. And we were ready for something new, which is good, because 1997, Wizards of the Coast buys TSR, and everything changes. From this point forward, the people who own D&D are not the people who invented D&D, and that will eventually cause some big problems. But Wizards of the Coast was, back then, still owned by nerds who loved D&D. They thought of themselves, probably correctly, as having rescued D&D. This may seem strange in this day and age, but in the 90s, D&D was pretty much forgotten. People had moved on to other RPGs, and the consensus was that D&D was old and mostly for 13-year-olds. My group was still playing 2nd edition regularly, though we also played lots of other RPGs, but it was definitely showing its age. Not only were there lots of cool and more modern games like Deadlands that didn't really have anything in common with classic dungeon crawling monster fighting, there were cool new games for dungeon crawling monster fighting, like Earth Dawn. So by 1999, 2nd edition specifically, and D&D in general, was feeling very old, and we were ready for something new. Wizards of the Coast takes its Pokemon and Magic the Gathering money, and they buy TSR, and they make a new edition of D&D. This is the 5th edition of D&D, so they called it 3rd edition. I lost a friend over this edition. I mean, I'm sure there were many reasons for this, but a friend left our group because even though we'd been playing 2nd edition for years, we all immediately jumped ship for 3rd edition. And my friend, I think he was bent out of shape because we never even asked him what he thought. Just us assuming he would be excited the way we were was part of the problem. 3rd edition was a major change. It marks the beginning of what I call modern D&D, or modern D20 fantasy, really. Every edition of D&D since 3rd edition works like 3rd edition. In fact, a lot of retro clones take 3E design and apply it to 70s D&D. They all use the D20 and the stats the same way. The bonuses all work the same way. We are still living in the 3rd edition era, so to speak, and I would be very surprised if that changed in my lifetime. I'm not going to go into it. This video is already long enough. We don't need to do a deep dive into 3E. If you want that, I got a whole video series about this, link below. But whatever else is true, going from 5th edition to 5.5 will be nowhere near as big a deal as going from 2nd edition to 3rd. 3rd edition brought in a whole new generation of D&D nerd, partly because that's just how time works, but also because Wizards of the Coast invested a lot of money in promoting and growing D&D. This is a really important point, a really important point. 3rd edition in the early 2000s was the only time in D&D history where the company that owned D&D invested in it. TSR couldn't invest in D&D. D&D was the thing making the money. So when they bought ads, which was a big deal, they were doing it with D&D money. But pre-Hasbro, Wizards of the Coast invested Magic the Gathering money into D&D because they wanted to grow the hobby. They wanted to bring new players in, and they spent a lot of money doing it. And it worked. A lot of people bought and played 3rd edition. So I think this marks the 3rd generation of D&D player, the folks who came in because of that investment. And obviously, new players don't worry much about converting. They're new. They don't own any of the old stuff. I often think of my teenage years as my peak D&D period, and while we certainly played a lot because we had, like summers and stuff that adults don't get, I think actual peak D&D for me was this era. I was running 2 different games every week for years, one at work and one at home. I was playing in several games at the same time. It was a huge boom period for D&D, and I fear that era will never come again. I think the 5e era is similar, but not because of 5e. I think it's because of Stranger Things and Critical Role. 5e was just the edition that happened to exist when these other cultural phenomena exploded. One thing we've always seen with every edition is folks who think that charging money for these products is somehow sinful, that producing supplements is a kind of immoral behavior that should be punished. And the only reason any company ever makes anything besides core rulebooks is because they are greedy. This happens with every edition. It's already happening with 5.5. Yes, there are game companies that are awful and manipulative because they are literally just trying to make a line go up for their investors, and they will do literally anything to make that happen. But most companies in most industries view firing all their employees after a product ships as the actual bad thing. They built a team, they made a great product, and they don't want to fire all those people. And they like the game and the hobby, and they want to make more products for it. But there's a certain kind of person who comments on every release with some variation of, great, another cash grab. I don't know what kind of lives these people lead, but presumably they do not get fired every time they finish a task at work. Devs love games, and they want to make more of them, and all we dream about is having a hit game that lots of people love so we can make more dope shit for it. Well, 3rd edition arrives, and there are a lot of supplements. A lot. I think they were putting a book out every month for a while. But that was back before digital media and PDFs, so a lot of these books were soft cover, black and white, no color. That was an exciting time to be in the hobby. The company that owned D&D also had this other game that was basically a license to print money. So they take some of that money and they spend it on growing the D&D market. D&D suddenly becomes the biggest RPG in the world after having spent the better part of a decade being basically a budget title. It gave those of us who never left the game a new reason to get excited. And we did. It brought a lot of people back to D&D who had left years ago, and it brought in a whole bunch of new people because Wizards of the Coast was buying ads in real magazines normal people read. This is important to me. I've loved and played every edition of D&D. I am not an edition warrior. I think those people are weirdos. I remember there was some little effort put into a conversion guide, but AD&D and 2nd edition were just way too different from 3rd edition. You couldn't really convert. But I don't think most players needed to convert anything. You were excited by the new edition, or you were literally new to the hobby. So you start a new campaign using the new rules. So that's a lesson. When there is a big change in an edition, like 2nd edition to 3rd edition, people don't really worry about converting. They just start new campaigns. They are excited by the new rules. They start a new campaign. I know lots of people, including me, used each big change in the rules to shake up their world, have some major event happen to explain, or really just have an excuse for why these new heroes and monsters are suddenly all over the place. This is tricky. I refer you to my friend who basically left our group because he was happy with things the way they were and weren't interested in change. What happens when you're excited by a new edition, but not everyone in your group is? Well, someone's got to compromise. You can't have some people playing one edition and the rest playing a completely different edition all at the same table. But the good news is 5.5 looks like it's a minor change, and I suspect there will be lots of people playing 5e who don't even know there's a new edition. They're not online all the time, or if they are, they're not hanging out in those spaces where people meme about this stuff, and so it'll just pass them by and they will be none the wiser. And I think for a lot of people, especially if you use a VTT, buying all the books again when the rules aren't changing that much, or even buying them twice if you want the rules in print and in your VTT of choice, this is not worth it. A lot of people just said, well, what's new? And someone would explain what they had changed, and then you would just do that. You didn't necessarily need to buy the books. Oh, your bonuses aren't tied to your ancestry anymore. Okay, cool. I'll just do that in my game. Almost everyone I knew enthusiastically jumped into 3rd edition. We could not wait. We were anxiously refreshing news sites, which was a new thing in the hobby in the year 2000, eager for any tidbits about the new game. And part of this, and I think this is important, so of course I buried it here like 26 minutes into the script. Part of this is some people get bored with the rules. At first, they are new and exciting, and you can see why the designers were really excited. Then you just get used to the rules, and they're not the new shiny anymore, and you start to notice cracks, problems. Well, of course, they designed, 20 or 30 levels across like 12 classes. What is that, like 240 class levels to test and balance? which they don't do. So over the course of years, you start noticing a lot of stuff that just doesn't work very well. Well, of course not, because they had to design 240 class levels and hundreds of monsters, but they didn't have time to test all of that. You're doing the testing, and they feel like they can't reduce the number of levels, even though they know almost no one makes it even to 13th level. So the new shiny wears off, and the stuff you were excited by is not that exciting anymore, and you start noticing a lot of stuff that annoys you. So you get excited for something new. This is natural, and I don't think it should be seen as a problem. It is a hobby. We like it when there is cool new stuff to talk about. It's fun. 3rd edition was like that. We were used to AD&D, but it was really janky, and this was new. I actually think folks would be really excited by a new edition of D&D right now. If they just came out and said, we have listened to your feedback, we are totally overhauling the rules, we have a ton of cool new ideas we think you will like that will make the game miles better. Or, kilometers better or whatever, right? Like if they had a vision for a new edition, well, we would all be really interested. Big new editions like AD&D, 3rd edition, 4th edition, they get people excited. We like being excited about the future of our hobby. That should not seem weird. But those big new editions split the audience into those people who, it's not that they weren't bored by the old rules, it's just that they don't see the rules as being a thing to be bored or excited by. They just like the fact that they know these rules, and that is this edition's virtue. The grognards grumble because they know these old rules. That's what makes them good. Not any quality of them, just these are the rules I know, so this is, by definition, the best edition. I think that's where edition warring comes from. I don't actually think it has anything to do with any specific rule or approach to the rules. The old players know the old rules, and that makes the old rules the best. The new players are excited by the new rules, and that makes the new rules the best. So you end up with these 4 estates in the hobby. You have the money people who are watching the long tail get smaller and smaller, and they decide it's time to get a new edition of the game out to generate more revenue. You have the designers who are also players and DMs who are super familiar with all the ways the current edition is janky, and they are excited to make something new. They have a vision. They are artists. These two groups do not get along. The money people want to protect the brand, change as little as possible. The devs want to make a great game, and they think they know how to do that. Then you have the people who like the old edition and don't see any reason to switch, and the people excited by the new edition. And these two groups don't get along. The only groups in this quadrat or whatever who do get along are the devs and the folks looking forward to the new edition. The grognards resent the money people, for good reason, but they also resent the devs for daring to improve on the perfect game, and they resent the new players. The new players resent the old players, mostly because their main experience dealing with the old players is that they act like assholes and shit all over the new game and the new players. The devs don't like the money people because the money people, by and large, don't care about the hobby. Selling D&D books, it just doesn't make that much money, and it never will. That, I think, more than anything, is the reason we're getting 5.5. So the devs never get the support they need from the money people and often feel like they're being treated like shit. Because they are. I've seen interviews with the original 5e devs who said they were all waiting to get their pink slips because Hasbro seemed so disinterested in the tabletop game. They said it should be called D&D Last because no one at the company cared about D&D and they just wanted to turn it into a legacy product. Which I think, by and large, they did. The money people mostly just want to sell D&D t-shirts and trick people into investing in D&D movies to make the line go up. And they resent everyone who isn't an investor. Ugh. It's a mess. But for a few years in the early 2000s, it was really exciting. And even though we were all excited by 3E back in 2000, by 2008, we were ready for something new. 3rd edition was the most robustly designed version of the game ever. There were rules for everything, and those rules were often very well thought out and very tedious. But we didn't know how tedious they were at first because we were in love with how logical everything was. Sure, it's 1,600 words of explanation just to figure out how to grapple somebody, but it made sense and it was so detailed. But over time, the fact that there was a rule for everything and those rules were so detailed, it just wore you down. You just stopped grappling people because you didn't want to try and read those rules again. It was so bad. In one playtest at Wizards of the Coast, somebody who knew basically nothing about D&D watching a group playing 3rd edition said, "It's 30 minutes of fun packed into 4 hours." That stung because it was true. They made a game with very detailed rules covering lots of scenarios, and we liked that. We liked how robust it was, but we didn't like how robust it was. It's complicated. Our relationship with this hobby is complicated. At first, we were all wowed by how systematized everything was, but after a couple of years, that same incredible level of detail, it just wore us out. It wasn't really possible to keep all the rules in your head, so you were often arguing about how you thought it worked, and you had to stop everything and look it up. And nothing I'm saying in this video was true for every group. You will see people in the comments saying, well, we never ... Sure, of course. But I was playing in many groups, running multiple games, and I was very online, and I can tell you this was a popular sentiment. Damn, look how detailed these rules are. And then, damn, look how detailed these rules are. So Wizards starts to think, maybe there's a better way. Maybe a new edition could solve all of this, and we could clean up like 40 years of weirdness and go back and solve a lot of problems, like how high-level wizards can basically rewrite reality, while high-level fighters are just swinging their sword more. Remember percentile strength? That was literally just a patch Gary came up with to try to keep fighters relevant at higher levels. So Wizards of the Coast wonders, could we solve all this and really revise the game? Well, something weird happens about this time, which no one talks about because very few people know about it. Hasbro, the company that bought TSR, the folks that made D&D, decided to divide all of their brands, whatever you can think of, Transformers, G.I. Joe, Magic the Gathering, D&D, into core and non-core. A core brand was one that made at least $50 million a year, and you had to come to the board and convince them you had a path to $100 million a year. If you could do that, you were a core brand, and you got investment dollars. If you couldn't, then you weren't a core brand, and you got throttled quite severely. No investment money. You're sort of on your own. Right? In other words, Wizards of the Coast could no longer decide to spend Magic the Gathering money on D&D. That wasn't up to them. Because Hasbro owned them. They couldn't and can't just do whatever they think is best for D&D. So Hasbro says $100 million a year or bust. Well, Magic the Gathering, obviously a core brand. D&D? The entire category, meaning every RPG sold each year, is only about 50 million. And no one believed there was a path there for D&D to get to 100 million a year. How are you going to do that selling books? So Magic gets the investment dollars. D&D gets, well, thank God Stranger Things and Critical Role eventually came along. But for a moment, it seemed like there might be some brave new world awaiting us on that farther shore. Maybe the devs and the money people could move forward together. The dev team thought we could fix all this stuff and make a really good game, while the money people said, we think we know how to get to 100 million. If you're still here, first of all, go hydrate and maybe get a cookie in case your blood sugar is crashing. If you're still here, pay close attention to this part because history is literally repeating itself as we speak. Wizards pitched the Hasbro C-suite on a new edition of D&D. Now, the CEO, the CFO, the COO, they don't care about the rules of D&D. Even if they know what D&D is, no one in that room thinks you can get to 100 million a year selling books. So, Wizards of the Coast, what you got? Well, they pitched the board on a digital initiative. All D&D tools online for a monthly fee. Make a character online, build encounters online, design, edit monsters, and even play the game online. That's right, a virtual tabletop, a VTT, for this new edition of D&D. Now, this is around 2005, so they weren't talking about loot boxes yet, but it does seem obvious that allowing people around the world to all play together, no need to manifest a group of players in meat space, that could get D&D to 100 million a year. That was 4th edition, and this was a major change, and there has never been, and I submit there never will be, an edition of D&D more radical than this one. The devs really did fix all those weird, janky, nonsense issues with the game, and it did exactly what you would expect. It split the audience. Because lots of players, they don't care if it's janky or not. They know these rules, therefore, these rules are good. But My group, remember, we'd been playing since AD&D. We loved 4th edition. My friend Jim, who bought the original edition of D&D when it came out in 1974, said, I think 4E is the best designed version of D&D ever. So there were lots of people who loved 4th edition, including a lot of grognards. But there were a lot of people who hated it, including a lot of grognards. And here I want to explain why I think that is, and why I think the reporting surrounding this era is always sort of wrong. In my incredibly personal, but still moderately well-informed opinion, the game the grognards hated was not 4th edition. It wasn't any edition of D&D. It was World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft comes out in 2004, and it's like somebody dropped a bomb on all of gaming. This is no joke. A friend who worked at a big publisher told me, we track these things with market data, and what happens is, when someone discovers WoW, this is 15 years ago, keep in mind, they basically disappear as consumers for about 9 months. They play nothing else. They spend no money. They just play WoW until the shine wears off, and then they kind of come up for air and go back to being normal gamers. Well, this was exactly my experience. My group instantly converted into WoW players, and all other games were forgotten for quite a while. And I was also online during this period, and I saw this happening everywhere. It was heartbreaking. There were so many DMs complaining, miserable online, because their entire group, the hobby, an entire way of life, just collapsed. It was way easier to get together in WoW than to do it in person. Yeah, of course. And it's basically the same fantasy. Elves and dwarves and rangers and warriors and fighting monsters and experience points and leveling up. And for me, personally, I was just as in love with WoW as everybody else. I 5-boxed WoW for months. But a lot of these DMs resented World of Warcraft. They could have just played WoW with their friends and had a good time. But some DMs seem to think, I've done all this world building. My players owe me. How dare they leave my table for that stupid game? When the players are like, what? It's fun and easier. We can play every night. Just plug in your headphones, come play with us. But the DMs felt betrayed. These folks were pissed. I can't describe how pissed. They hated World of Warcraft because WoW killed their group. It killed their hobby. And then 4th edition comes out. And 4E is a modern game. All characters always have a couple of cool things they can do on their turn. No more, I swing my sword. So 4E looks a lot more like a tactical JRPG, like a video game. You know, games where combat is actually fun. But no one compares it to those games because the D&D grognards have never even heard of those games. They compare it to WoW. And that becomes the story. Oh, 4E is just trying to be WoW. Well, I think it was just trying to be a fun game. The digital tools were amazing, way better than the tools we have now. But the VTT never materialized, and so new players kept coming in, and they didn't know they were supposed to hate 4th edition. They just thought it was fun. But I don't think anything happened around this time to create a new generation of D&D players the way a new VTT would have. Something else happened instead. You see, Wizards decides, we got all these digital tools. We don't need Dragon Magazine anymore. But they had, perhaps foolishly, farmed out Dragon Magazine to another company. Paizo. This is part of that contraction of the budget I was talking about. No more Magic the Gathering money, so we can't afford to publish a monthly magazine too, if you count Dungeon Magazine, but I don't think that was ever monthly. So instead, they licensed the rights to Paizo, who publishes Dragon and Dungeon magazines, and they put out a lot of cool adventures in Dungeon Magazine. They developed their own reputation for making really good third-party content. Ahem. Wizards of the Coast has a new edition brewing with all new digital tools. Who needs these old magazines? So they decide not to renew the agreement with Paizo. Fine, Paizo says, we'll make our own edition of D&D. Pathfinder, which is suspiciously close to 3rd edition. I mean, it is way more of its own game now, but Pathfinder is basically what would have happened if they just kept revising 3rd edition, which sounded real good to the people who liked 3rd edition and didn't want any newfangled game, of whom there were a lot. The VTT never materialized, which means 4th edition is sort of dead on arrival. I mean, it sold really well. I don't think there was ever a time when Pathfinder outsold it, but the narrative online had become so anti-4E, everyone just decided Pathfinder was a huge hit and 4E was a flop, and the folks in charge at Paizo were very happy to encourage people to think this. Teos Abadia covers this in his blog. It is really well sourced, link in the doobly-doo. At this point, edition warring was almost all we had. We had 4E people, 3E people, Pathfinder people, and oh yeah, all those folks who picked up AD&D in the 70s and 80s who weren't paying attention to any of this. 4th edition eventually gets its own 2nd edition, which they called Essentials. Basically just clean up the math and make some classes that work more like the classic fighter for players who were confused by the idea that their fighter could do cool stuff like everybody else. And that is a real thing. I played with one of those people. But the writing was on the wall. I got sick of 4th edition because I was introducing a lot of new players to the hobby, and I wanted to give them that classic dungeon crawling experience, which 4th edition is really bad at. I'm not talking about fighting monsters in a dungeon. It's great at that. I mean the classic survival horror thing. What I should have done was use 4E for heroic fantasy and some kind of retro clone for survival horror dungeon crawling. These days, I'd probably use Shadowdark for that. But then 5th edition comes out and it sort of does heroic fantasy and it sort of does dungeon crawling, and it felt like a relief. I don't remember a lot of edition warring between 4 and 5e, and I think that's because of how technology changed. 4e came out when forums were still the hotbed of internet discussion. Facebook is 2004, YouTube is 2005, Twitter is 2006. This is the beginning of social media, and whatever else was true about all those previous D&D generations, they weren't huge adopters of social media. I assume they still play their favorite edition regularly and probably have their own forums that they like talking about it on, like EN World or Dragon's Foot. But for the new generation who came in with Stranger Things and Critical Role, they just weren't on those forums. These different groups are on different platforms, and so not much arguing. You know, it wasn't until I made a video that suddenly hundreds of thousands of people discovered that there was this really cool earlier edition of D&D called 4E. So 5e comes out in 2014, Critical Role comes out in 2015, and Stranger Things in 2016, and that brings a whole new generation to the hobby. It may be the biggest generation yet. Surely it's making Hasbro money hand over fist. Well, D&D isn't that kind of game. You know, you see folks online complaining about the core rules costing like $100, but compare that to the average Magic the Gathering or Warhammer investment. Even if you bought every official 5e book, that's nothing compared to how much people expect to spend on these other games. So, yeah, a big hit, but there is still no path forward to $100 million a year. So, still no investment. That's why my videos were so popular. It's why folks like Ginny D become huge, because they're doing the onboarding and promotion Wizards of the Coast can't. They don't have the budget. But what if they tried the VTT idea again? Because now we know better. We know that a monthly fee ain't going to do it. We have loot crates now. If they can build a VTT for D&D, and if you can put loot crates in it, you know, maybe hire a producer from Zynga and put him in charge of all of D&D, then we could be on our way to $100 million a year. And who doesn't like loot crates? Well, now it's now. And you're about to get a new edition of D&D, and since it looks like a pretty minor change, basically roll a lot of the stuff from that Tasha's book into the core rules, I think of it as 5.5. You don't have to switch, but eventually you probably will. You'll hear about the new rules, and some of them you'll like, and you can probably just adopt them without investing in new rule books. But once you've done that, eventually you figure, well, what else is in these new rules? And then you're playing 5.5. I don't think you'll have to adapt any 5e adventures to 5.5, and I think that's mostly because that's what they have said, but also that's what the 0.5 is about. Second edition, which was like AD&D 0.5, very minor change. 3.5, very minor change from third edition. 4e Essentials, which was 4.5, very minor change from fourth edition. 5.5, same thing. Edition wars tend to happen between the integers, not the decimals. So almost an hour-long video just to tell you, you can relax. You may have players who feel strongly about switching while you are happy with how things are. Well, talk to them. Ask them what they like about the new rules. You will discover you probably like, or don't hate, the actual specific rules they are excited by, so you can tell that player, okay, well, we can just use those rules. Just start using them in your game. Eventually, you can pick up the new rules if and when it becomes an issue, or You could just stick with 5e. Lots of people will. It is not virtuous or sinful. It's fine. At the end of the day, I think the whole point of 5.5 is to publish a license-free version of the rules with a VTT to lock in a whole new generation into a digital ecology to sell them loot crates. For a whole new generation of D&D players, that will be D&D, and the idea of playing at the table will seem weird and eventually impossible. I mean, imagine someone who only knew D&D from Baldur's Gate 3 and telling them, oh, there's a tabletop game of this. They would not imagine Dungeons and Dragons as we play it. They would imagine something more like Gloomhaven, probably. The same thing we all love about this hobby is exactly what makes it impossible to monetize the way Hasbro needs. But I love that. Already we see tons of people saying, Flea Mortals looks amazing. But I don't play 5e anymore. There are lots of other games, and I feel certain that is only going to increase. I do think we're going to get something more like the 90s, where there's an explosion of new RPGs, and people try lots of different games. I may do a video on trying new RPGs. It would be way shorter than this video. If you made it this far, you get a gold star. Do not be cynical about this hobby. I think its best days are ahead. Even if we're not all playing literally the same game, in fact, I think it's better that way. Going to Gen Con in the 90s and seeing all of these amazing RPGs with different fantasies and tons of people playing them was awesome. It is something to look forward to. Thanks for watching, folks. I hope you found something in this epic video interesting. I cannot wait to see the comments and learn how I'm wrong about everything. You know we're working on our own original fantasy RPG right now. I don't need to remind you. We think we've got something special, and we hope you'll come along for the ride. The culture of D&D, the hobby, will always be close to my heart, obviously. Otherwise, why would I make an hour-long video about the history of it all? But we're all fed up with Hasbro, and I am frankly fed up with the do I miss my turn die. When I think about going back to the Chain of Acheron or Dusk, I look forward to doing it in our game because I think it's going to be more fun. And if that sounds cool to you, click the link below to get an email alert when the crowdfunder goes live. It's going to be a whole thing. We got a second channel where we're covering the development of this new game, warts and all, and you're going to get a new video next week about how weapons work and all the stuff we tried and threw out before we came up with a cool answer. Links in the doobly-doo. I'm never going to slag somebody off for playing 5e. I played every edition of D&D, including 5e, for years. I was never an edition warrior, and I have no plans to start. I plan on spinning up a new campaign in the new year, and that means getting back behind the screen for real, and that means more mistakes, and that means more videos. It's been a while since we had a YouTube live stream, so let's get together this Friday, December 1st, and just hang out for an hour or two. Until then, thanks for watching, folks. Be good to each other. Peace out.